When I told people I was moving to the Philippines by myself, most of them didn't think I was crazy because I was moving overseas. They thought I was crazy because of the word alone. No wife, no girlfriend, no kids coming with me, no buddy tagging along for moral support. Just me, two suitcases I'd packed and repacked 4 times, and a one-way ticket I'd bought at 11 o'clock at night after one too many beers, and about 6 months of telling myself I'd think about it some more. And if I'm being honest with you right now, sitting here almost 2 years later, I still wasn't completely sure it was the right decision the morning I left. I was 63 years old, divorced, not in the dramatic sense. More in the slow, quiet, nobody did anything wrong, we just stopped being anything to each other sense. Retired from a job in facilities management I'd done for 29 years. The kind of job where you fix other people's problems all day and come home too tired to think about your own. And I had spent the better part of a year watching videos about guys my age starting over somewhere warm, somewhere cheap, somewhere that wasn't the same gray subdivision I'd lived in for 2 decades. Nobody, and I mean nobody, prepared me for what actually happened once I landed. Not the videos, not the forums, not my own imagination. Stick with me because I'm going to tell you the parts nobody puts in the highlight reel. And if you're watching this from somewhere cold tonight, drop a comment and tell me where you are. I read every single one of them. My name is Walter. I'm 65 now, though I was 63 the day I actually got on the plane. And I want to start there, at the airport, because that's where I first understood I was really doing this, and not just talking about doing it over coffee like I had been for the better part of a year. I'd flown plenty in my life. Business trips mostly, a couple of vacations with my ex-wife back when we still took those together. But standing at that counter with my passport in hand, watching the agent type for what felt like much too long before looking back up at me, my stomach dropped straight through the floor. She asked if I had proof of onward travel. I knew the Philippines required it for tourists. I'd read about it a dozen times, and in that exact moment, standing there with a line forming behind me, my mind went completely, embarrassingly blank. Thankfully, a guy from one of the online groups I'd joined had warned me to buy one of those refundable onward tickets travelers use just for this purpose, and I'd done it 3 days earlier without fully understanding why at the time. I fumbled my phone out, pulled up the confirmation with hands that were not quite steady, and handed it over. She smiled, handed my passport back, told me I was good to go. It was such a small moment, but standing there at that counter, I remember thinking, very clearly, this is actually happening. Nobody warns you that the most terrifying part isn't the goodbye at the gate. It's a stranger at a counter asking you a question you should have had a better answer for. The flight felt endless in the way only a flight across an entire ocean can. I tried to sleep. I watched 2 movies I don't remember a single detail of now. I looked out the window more times than I could count, at nothing, just clouds, just dark. And the whole time, one question kept circling back no matter how hard I tried to think about anything else. What if I've made a mistake? Not a dramatic kind of fear, just a quiet, persistent hum underneath everything, the kind that doesn't go away just because you tell it to shut up. When the plane finally landed in Manila, I felt that mix you only really feel a few times in your life, excitement and dread tangled up so tightly you can't separate them anymore. I stepped outside the airport and the heat hit me like a hand on my chest. I'd read about the heat. I'd watched dozens of videos about the heat. I was not prepared for the heat. Within minutes, I was sweating through a shirt I'd specifically picked out because it seemed breathable. The next surprise was smaller but somehow more disorienting. Communication. I'd heard correctly that Filipinos speak English widely, and they do. But I learned fast that didn't mean every single conversation would be effortless. Sometimes it was. Sometimes we both just smiled and laughed and did our best to meet in the middle. After an entire adult life spent in one country, doing the same small errands the same automatic way for decades, suddenly everything required effort. Ordering food, flagging down a taxi, asking for directions, buying groceries. Things I'd never once had to think about back home suddenly took concentration I didn't know I'd have to spend. By the time I got to my hotel that first night, I was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the flight. It was mental. Everything around me was new, and everything new takes a toll you don't notice accumulating until you're lying in an unfamiliar bed wondering if everyone back home had actually been right about you. If any part of that first night feeling sounds familiar to you, from any big change you've ever made in your own life, tell me about it in the comments. I'd really like to know I wasn't the only one who felt that way. I woke up before sunrise the next morning, partly jet lag, partly because my mind simply would not stop turning things over. For a few disoriented seconds, I forgot where I was entirely. Then it came back to me all at once. I was in the Philippines, alone, thousands of miles from anyone who'd known me longer than a week. I got dressed and went for a walk because I didn't know what else to do with that much nervous energy at 5 in the morning. And almost immediately, I noticed something that stuck with me ever since. People smiled at me. Not everyone, but enough that it was genuinely strange after so many years of walking through American parking lots and grocery stores without a single person acknowledging I existed. A nod here, a quick good morning there. Small things. But when you're standing alone in a country you've never set foot in before, small things matter more than they have any right to. I found a market that first morning. Nothing fancy, just local vendors with tables of fruit and vegetables and fish so fresh it looked like it had been pulled from the water an hour earlier. I walked around that market 3 full times, not because I needed anything, but because I genuinely could not stop looking. The mangoes alone looked better than anything I'd ever seen in an American grocery store. There were fruits I couldn't name and vegetables I didn't recognize and fish stacked on ice with eyes still clear and bright. I bought a few things I recognized and carried them back to my hotel, and the whole transaction probably took twice as long as it should have, partly because I was learning, partly because my hands were a little unsteady with nerves I couldn't quite explain. But I remember feeling strangely, almost embarrassingly proud afterward. Not because I'd done anything difficult exactly, but because I had done it completely on my own, in a country where 3 days earlier I hadn't known a single soul. The first few weeks I settled into something resembling a routine. Morning walks that got a little longer each day, a few more streets each time, a little more confidence each time. But not everything came easily. The heat continued to wear me down in ways I never fully adjusted to. I'd step outside for 20 minutes and come back needing to sit down. I learned, slowly and a little painfully, that midday was not the time for errands of any kind. I also discovered that simple tasks took dramatically longer than I expected. Things that would have taken 10 minutes back home sometimes took an hour here, and at first that frustrated me in a way that honestly embarrassed me a little, a grown man losing his patience over a trip to the pharmacy. Then one afternoon, sitting in a small restaurant watching families take their time over a meal, nobody checking their phones, nobody rushing toward whatever was next, something shifted. The Philippines wasn't asking me to slow down. I had simply spent so many decades moving at a pace that wasn't actually mine that I'd forgotten what a different rhythm even felt like. But I want to be honest with you about the parts that weren't easy, because a story that's all sunshine and mangoes is a story you should be a little suspicious of. There were evenings, more than I expected, when the loneliness arrived without any warning at all. I remember sitting alone in my apartment one night about a month in, scrolling through photos I'd taken that first week, the market, the streets, the food, strangers smiling at me on sidewalks, and on paper every single image looked great. But underneath it was something I hadn't accounted for. Not constant loneliness, not even frequent, just certain specific moments. The moment something funny happened and I instinctively reached for my phone to call someone, only to remember there wasn't really anyone in that time zone to call. The moment I passed a family laughing together at dinner. The moment it really landed that I was further from everyone I'd ever known than I had been at any other point in my entire life. Back home, I'd had a routine even if I didn't love it. A regular bar stool, a barber I'd gone to for 15 years, neighbors who at least recognized my truck in the driveway. Here at 63, I was starting completely from zero. And starting from zero at 63 is not the same thing as starting from zero at 25, no matter what the inspirational quotes online want you to believe. People kept asking me the same question, both online and on phone calls home, over and over, in different words, but always circling the same thing. Was I out here looking for a girlfriend? At first it actually made me laugh, because that genuinely wasn't why I'd come. I'd been the one who initiated the divorce, quietly and without much drama, because I'd realized I would rather be alone and at peace than next to someone and lonely anyway. Most of the stories you hear about guys retiring overseas alone seem to circle straight back to romance pretty quick. That wasn't remotely what I was after. If I'm being completely honest, I was far more interested in finding a reliable spot to get a decent haircut than I was in finding a girlfriend. That's not me being bitter about my marriage. It's just the truth. I was curious, in an abstract sort of way, about what dating might even look like here someday. But curiosity is a very different thing from actively looking, and I never confuse the two. What actually surprised me, more than any of that, was independence. Every single week brought some new small challenge to solve completely on my own, figuring out transportation, understanding how the pharmacy worked, finding a reliable mechanic for the second-hand motorbike I eventually bought, learning which part of the market had the freshest fish on which days. There were plenty of mistakes, more than a few wrong turns, literal and otherwise, and a handful of afternoons where I felt genuinely overwhelmed standing on some unfamiliar street with no idea which direction my apartment was even in. But every single time I solved one of those problems without anyone's help, my confidence grew just a little. And slowly I started to realize something uncomfortable about myself. For years, without ever consciously deciding to, I had quietly started believing that certain things belonged to younger guys. Starting over belonged to younger guys. Moving across the world alone belonged to younger guys. Building a brand new life from nothing belonged to younger guys. And yet here I was, at 63, doing exactly that, one imperfect day at a time. If any of you watching are sitting on the edge of a decision like this yourselves, comment below and just tell me what's holding you back. Sometimes saying it out loud to strangers on the internet is the easiest place to start. About 4 months in, I had an experience that genuinely shook me, though it wouldn't sound like much if I told it to anyone back home. I came down with a fever that wouldn't break. Nothing dramatic in hindsight, but serious enough that I needed an actual doctor and not just rest and fluids. Back in the States, I would have known instantly what to do, which clinic, which insurance card, which forms. Here I genuinely wasn't sure where to begin. A year earlier, that uncertainty alone would have sent me into a full panic, the kind I'd have never admitted to out loud. Instead, I simply figured it out. I asked the front desk at my apartment building for a recommendation. I got directions from a neighbor I'd barely spoken 3 sentences to before that morning. I found a small clinic, explained what I could in broken half sentences, and a lot of pointing, and a doctor who spoke careful, patient English took it from there. The entire visit, with blood work included, cost less than a single emergency room copay would have cost me at home. I sat afterward in a plastic chair in the waiting area and realized something that mattered far more than the illness itself. The problem hadn't been important. What mattered was that I had solved it without falling apart. Because that, it turned out, was what this whole move had actually been about underneath everything else. Not the Philippines specifically. Not even retirement, really. It was about quietly proving to myself, after a marriage where I'd slowly stopped trusting my own instincts on almost everything, that I was still entirely capable. Capable of adapting, capable of learning, capable of taking a real risk and landing on my feet. There was a man at that clinic, an orderly named Rico, who noticed I was alone and stuck around for a few extra minutes after the doctor had already moved to the next patient, just talking about nothing in particular, the weather, the market down the street, whether I'd tried the little eatery 2 blocks over yet. It was such a small gesture, but I sat a little longer than I needed to in the tricycle on the way back to my apartment afterward, not from the fever, but from how unfamiliar it felt to be looked after by a complete stranger who had absolutely no reason to bother. I want to be honest about the practical realities too, because I think it does a disservice to skip past them. Healthcare here has genuinely impressed me for routine, everyday matters. The cost alone is almost hard to believe coming from the American system. But I'm realistic that for anything truly serious, I'd be looking at a flight to a bigger city with bigger hospitals, and I keep savings specifically earmarked for exactly that possibility, along with a modest travel medical policy. The visa paperwork has its own particular brand of tedium, extensions, offices that close for lunch at unpredictable hours, lines that test your patience in ways American bureaucracy somehow never quite managed to. None of it is unbearable. All of it requires patience I didn't always have in the beginning and have, slowly, had to learn the hard way. A few months after that fever, I found myself sitting in a small cafe one afternoon, just watching people walk by on the street outside, and a strange thought crossed my mind that caught me completely off guard. I wasn't thinking about whether I'd made a mistake. I wasn't comparing the cafe to anything back home. I wasn't quietly wondering when or if I'd eventually move back. I was simply living my life, fully present in an ordinary afternoon. the way you do somewhere that's actually become your home rather than somewhere you're just visiting with a long lease. Without ever noticing the exact moment it happened, the Philippines had stopped feeling like an experiment and started feeling like my actual life. Around that same time, the phone calls from home started changing in a way that told me something had shifted even before I'd fully admitted it to myself. In the early months, people mostly asked questions. How's the food? How's the weather? Do you feel safe? After several months, the questions became something else entirely. So, are you staying? I didn't have a simple answer the first time someone asked, and I remember that bothering me, because when I'd first arrived, I'd told myself this was just an experiment, that if it didn't work out, I could always go back, and that thought had been genuinely comforting in those early shaky weeks. It made the whole decision feel less permanent, less like something I'd actually have to commit to. But by then, I had favorite walking routes. I had a vendor at the market who set aside the good bananas for me without my asking anymore. I knew exactly which pharmacy to go to and exactly which tricycle drivers to wave down. Without ever sitting down and deciding to, I had built an entire routine. And routines, it turns out, have a quiet way of turning a place into a home whether you've officially decided to stay or not. I won't pretend every part of this has been easy, because it hasn't. And I think pretending otherwise does a disservice to anyone watching this who's seriously considering doing something similar. There are days the heat genuinely defeats me. There are days I'd give almost anything for one gray, cool, ordinary October afternoon, the kind I used to complain about constantly and now sometimes miss with an intensity that surprises me. There's a specific low-grade loneliness that never fully disappears, no matter how settled I become, a quiet awareness that I missed the shared childhood references, the inside jokes that take decades to build, the particular comfort of being known by people who've known you since before you were anyone in particular. At certain moments, especially during local celebrations, where everyone else seems to know exactly what to do and what to say, I feel that gap clearly. It's small, but it's there, and I'd be lying to you if I said otherwise. But here's what I've come to understand about that particular gap, and it's the thing I most want to leave you with if you've made it this far. That gap existed in my life back home too, in its own different shape. I'd simply stopped noticing it because it was familiar, woven so completely into the texture of an ordinary American life that it didn't register as loneliness anymore, just as normal. Here, at least, the gap makes a kind of sense. I have an obvious reason to be the slightly outside one, the foreigner still learning. And inside that obvious reason, people have pulled me closer, faster, and with more genuine warmth than I ever experienced in places I was technically supposed to belong to already. My son came to visit about a year in, which mattered to me more than I let on at the time. He'd been quietly worried, I think, picturing some sad, isolated version of his old man, living out a confused retirement on the other side of the planet, drinking alone on some balcony somewhere. Instead, he watched the guy at the market press extra mangoes into my hands and wave off my money. He watched my neighbor knock on my door with a plate of food for no particular reason at all. He sat with me on my small balcony one evening, and toward the end of the night he got quiet in the way he does when something's actually landing for him. And he said, "Dad, I think this is the calmest I've ever seen you." And I had to look away for a second out toward the street because he was right, and because I hadn't fully realized it myself until somebody who'd known me my whole life said it out loud. So here's what an ordinary day actually looks like for me now. I'm up early, no alarm needed anymore, my body simply adjusted to the light and the heat. Coffee on my small balcony, watching the street below slowly wake up, vendors, school kids in their uniforms, the first tricycles rattling past. A walk to the market most mornings for whatever looks freshest that day, trading hellos with people who genuinely know my name now. Afternoons I read, or rest through the worst of the heat, or video call my son and watch my grandkids hold things up to the camera and shout about them. Evenings I sit outside with a neighbor or two, talking about nothing important, which has somehow become one of my favorite parts of any given day. People ask me sometimes, both online and on those Sunday calls home, whether I regret it. Whether it was worth leaving everyone and everything familiar behind at 63 to start completely over alone in a country I'd never visited. And the honest answer is no. Not for a single day. Not because everything has been easy, because it hasn't, but because somewhere between that nervous guy standing at the airport counter fumbling for his phone and the man sitting here on this balcony right now, I found something I genuinely wasn't expecting. Not romance, not even really adventure, not in the way the word usually gets used. I found proof, real and specific and entirely my own, that I could still build something at 63 that nobody had to do for me and nobody could take credit for but me. If you're sitting somewhere tonight wondering whether it's too late to start over, whether 60 or 63 or 65 is somehow past the point where that's allowed, I want you to hear this clearly. It isn't. Comment below and tell me where you're watching from, and tell me honestly, what's the one thing that's actually stopping you? Not the polite reason, the real one. I read every single comment, and I promise you, I understand more of them than you'd expect. The fan's turning above me right now, the street's gone quiet for the evening, and I think, finally, at 65, I know exactly where I'm supposed to be.